All right, so now Pygame and Python are successfully installed on our computer. So we're ready to get started on the actual projectile simulator. And I have uploaded what I've made for the projectile simulator to this link here. So that's on the screen there. Now that's a rather long link, so I have a tiny URL as well. So this one right here will be much easier to type in. It's exactly the same link. You know how tiny URL works. It just shortens things down. So if you type this link here into your browser, it'll download the files that I've made. I'm going to put the Dropbox back on there for now, just in case either one stops working. These are just my personal Dropbox files, so if you're a professor that plans on using this for a very long time, I would urge you to download it and kind of save your own copy, because it's a pretty small file size. I can't think of a reason why I would need to delete this, but you know, at 10 years, 15 years down the road, who knows. So if you do plan on using it for a very long time, just make sure you've got a backup. And again, if you're a student that's working on this project, then this URL here is going to be the easier one to type in. So just pause the video there and type in what you need. So I have the luxury of copying here. I'm going to copy that link and I'm going to paste it in. And it's not actually going to take you to a website. It's just going to download some files for you. And so I'm going to show that in folder. It just downloads a little zip file there. I'm going to extract that. Extract it however you'd like to. We're going to extract that into our downloads folder. And then I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to go off to our Python. So I just clicked on the local drive, where we put Python in our root directory here. So in the C drive, you'll find Python 36, or whatever version you installed. The folder there, we're going to open that up. And I'm going to make a new folder that I'm going to call Projects. It's just good to stay organized when you're doing things like this. And maybe you really get into Python and you get lots of different projects going. And this way they can all have their own little folders and things don't get too messy. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Don't do that. We're just going to paste the folder that we already copied. So inside my little projects folder in Python, I now have my projectile simulator folder. And if we double click on that, we can see that we have a few scripts all set up for us. And we also have an images folder. And inside that images folder are just some graphics that I made. Depending on how far you go with this, you may or may not use all of them, but various balls, whichever one you like the best. There's different grids depending on how much we want to zoom in, and there's different color indicators for what type of motion we have, and some other things as well. So that's inside the images folder. And then, okay, so now we have three scripts kind of all set up for us. We have a function examples, a Pygame functions, and a shell script. The Pygame functions is something that a guy named Steve Paget, or Paget, I'm not sure how he would pronounce his name, he's done a lot of the work for us. This is the kind of the thing I'm talking about. There's a lot of different functions that he's done a lot of work in Python and in Pygame ahead of time, and so we're going to call on some of those functions. We don't really need to open that script, but just know that it's there. I did the function examples script. All that is, if you double click on any of these, it's going to open it as though it's an actual program, and so they're not going to do anything because these aren't made as programs. You guys are going to make one that you will be able to double click on if you want, but these are just empty scripts basically. They just define things. So what you want to do is you want to right click on them and edit with idle. Idle is that editor that we were going to use with Python, so we're going to open function examples with that. And in here you'll see, first of all, that most of the text is red. Most of the lines start with pound signs or hashtags, right? And that's a way of indicating to the computer that you want the computer to ignore that line. So you can see any of these red lines the computer is going to ignore. We call that a comment because it's really only made for people. You're telling the computer, look, I'm trying to explain to other people what I'm doing here. I'm trying to remind myself what I'm doing here. This isn't for you. You should just ignore this line, right? That's what the comments are. So inside of this, I've put in all the different functions that we're going to use from Steve's functions. Goodness, I'm stumbling here. His Pygame function script, right? And so something like, for instance, if you want to know how do I set up the size of the screen? Well, here's the command that you're going to call, and here's the different inputs that it'll take. And if it's still too confusing, then we've got some examples, right? If you just want to make a screen that's 800 by 600 pixels, this is how you would do it. If you wanted to set that to full screen, that true right there, we'll set it to full screen. So I've tried to explain all of the different things that we're going to do. At various times, throughout the videos, I'll ask you to pause it and try to do something yourself, because that's a much better way to learn how to code, is to try and figure out, with enough background knowledge, how to do this. And then if something goes wrong, then keep going on the video and see how I do it, and see where maybe something went wrong, right? So this is this one here, right? Creating sprites. So how do I create sprites? Sprites are just a term for visual images, like the ball is a sprite. The little dots we draw will be sprites. Well, here's the command line, and here's an example of how to do it. Right? So that's all the functions examples is. It's just useful. You might find that useful for yourself. Now the shell script, if we open that up, that's the thing that we're actually going to start doing some editing on. You'll notice that we have just a few lines of code, and then I've kind of tried to help us with an outline here. We're going to start by defining our screen. We'll declare some variables. We'll define some sprites, etc., etc. Okay, but the first thing we do is we're going to import everything from Steve's Pygame functions file. So that's what this line does. We're then going to initiate Pygame, and then just for the fun of it, we're going to set the caption on our window to say Projectile Simulator. You could set this to say whatever you wanted. It's just nice for it to say something besides the generic Windows stuff. So that's all we have here. This is just an empty script that we're going to start working on probably in the next video. I forgot we needed to get all this set up. And I also wanted to explain, just kind of without thinking about coding, the specifics of coding, I wanted to talk about how we're going to approach creating a projectile simulator, right? How do we do that? How do we tell a computer how to simulate projectile motion? And if you think about that, well, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to find some way to explain to a computer basically four things. You're going to need to be able to explain to a computer what a position is. You're going to need to be able to explain to a computer what velocity is, what acceleration is, and what time is. You're going to have to kind of define those four things for the computer. Now, luckily, two of those are pretty easy. Like position, well, computers have screens that have rows of pixels and columns of pixels, and so we'll just use that to our advantage. We'll tell it the x position and the y position in pixels. That'll be very simple. So x position is kind of taken care of. That's kind of obvious. Time will also be pretty simple because to start with, we're going to make a manual motion only. It'll only move time forward when we push a button. And so that makes time pretty simple too, because we just tell the computer, we'll make some variable, we'll call it a clock, or we'll call it time, or something like that. And we'll say each time I push this button, we'll specify some button, then advance the clock 1 second. Right? So that's going to be a very simple way of just 1 second goes by, and then 2 seconds, and then 3 seconds, and every time we push a button, a second goes by. So we can define time very easily. Velocity and acceleration, though, get a little trickier because you have to ask yourself, how am I going to tell the computer what I mean by velocity? Because in human terms, and when we talk about velocity, we say, well, it's how fast something is moving. But what do you mean? When you talk about the logic of that, when you talk about explaining a step-by-step process, do this, do this, do this, what do we mean when we say how fast something is moving? And if you give that a few minutes thought, you'll probably realize that what we're talking about is a change in position over time, right? So we've already defined positions, which is this pixel and this pixel, and that's the position of the thing. And so when we define velocity for the computer, we're going to say, each time I push this button, I want you to move it so many pixels, and we're going to call that velocity, right? Because that's effectively what velocity is. It's in a given period of time, say 1 second, how far did it move? It started here, right? And what's the new position after a second? And after another second, what's the new position? So velocity, we're going to tell the computer, is the thing that we're going to add to position each time we push that button. So a little more complicated, but it still kind of makes sense. And acceleration, it turns out, is basically the same thing. Acceleration is how quickly is the velocity changing, right? How quickly is the speed that the thing is moving changing over time? So we can basically do the same thing. We're going to tell the computer that acceleration is going to be the thing that we add to velocity each time. So after a second, add this much acceleration to the velocity. After another second, add it again and again and again. So now we have kind of a general plan of how we're going to attack projectile motion. And in the next video, I promise, we'll actually start doing some coding. So get your fingers ready, all warmed up, because we're ready to go.